She was 34 years old and she had $3 left in the world. The bank in Harlan Crossing, Kansas had taken her father's farm on a Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1903, taken it the way cold weather takes a garden, without apology, without sentiment. Simply arriving and leaving nothing standing. The man who had arranged it, a creditor's agent named Dobbins who wore a gray suit and carried a leather satchel that smelled of other people's ruin, had handed her a single document and told her she had until sundown to remove herself from the property. Her father had been dead 11 months. The dead had been older than she was. She walked the 6 miles into town with a canvas bag over one shoulder and those $3 folded into the pocket of her coat. She had nowhere to sleep. She had no family left within 500 miles. And when she passed the edge of town and saw the old Garvey water tower standing in a field of yellow grass, its legs warped, its tank green with age, the county's hand-painted auction notice nailed to one of its posts, she did something that would make every soul in Harlan Crossing laugh before the week was out. She bought it for $3. They called it the most foolish purchase in the county's memory. They said a woman with no land, no trade, and no roof over her head had spent her last coin on a rusted tank and 4 rotting legs. They could not have known, not one of them, that sealed inside the tower's upper hatch, locked away for over 2 decades and forgotten by the man who put it there, was something that would not only change the course of her life, but restore to an entire town what had been quietly stolen from them, 1 year at a time, for longer than most of them had dared to question. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nora Fenn. If you have ever lived somewhere that felt forgotten, or held on to something others told you was worthless, we would love to hear from you in the comments below. Nora Fenn was born on a homestead 8 miles outside of Harlan Crossing in the spring of 1869, the second child and only daughter of Edmund and Cecilia Fenn. Edmund was a quiet man, the kind of farmer who rose before the light and moved through his days with an unhurried economy of motion, doing what needed doing without announcement. Cecilia was a schoolteacher before she married, and she carried her education the way some women carry a lantern, not showing it off, but simply illuminating whatever room she happened to be standing in. It was Cecilia who taught Nora to read before she was 5. Who pressed a battered ledger book into her daughter's hands when Nora was 7 and explained that numbers were not merely quantities but a language. One that told the truth about the world when people would not. Every farm has a story, Cecilia said, her finger tracing a column of figures by lamplight. This is how you read it. Nora took to numbers the way some children take to music, instinctively, joyfully, with a kind of recognition that suggested she had been waiting for them all along. The farm was not wealthy, but it was honest. Edmund grew wheat and kept a modest herd, and in the good years the family ate well and set a little aside. In the dry years, which came often enough in that part of Kansas, they ate carefully and set aside nothing. They were not the sort of people who complained about the dry years. They understood that the land made no promises, only offers, and that an offer could be withdrawn. Nora had an older brother named Calvin who left for Colorado when she was 12, chasing silver rumor the way young men in those years chased everything, with full speed and little thought. He sent letters for a while, then stopped. Her parents did not speak of it much. The farm absorbed grief the way it absorbed weather, steadily, without visible change. There were evenings, Nora would recall in later years, when she sat on the porch steps after supper and watched her father walk the fence line in the dying light. And she understood without being told that he was searching for the shape of a life that had gone partly sideways, not in ruin, nothing so dramatic, but sideways in the way that quiet lives sometimes go when the people you planted them around leave or die and you are left standing among furrows you dug together with no one to help you tend them. Forward. What Nora kept from those years, the years of her growing up, was a particular set of skills that seemed modest in isolation but would prove, in time, to be formidable in combination. She could read a financial ledger the way her mother had taught her. She could survey a piece of land by eye with reasonable accuracy, having followed her father on every boundary walk since she was old enough to keep up. She could identify the structural soundness of a building by the way it settled, a talent born from years of watching Edmund shore up fence posts and reinforce barn walls. Her father explaining as he worked what held and what didn't, what rot looked like from the outside versus the inside, where water went when it had nowhere to go. And she could be still. This was perhaps the rarest of her gifts. In a world that rewarded noise and motion, Nora Fenn had learned early to be quiet and to watch. And she had come to understand that the things people revealed in their stillness were almost always more truthful than the things they announced in their activity. Cecilia died of pneumonia when Nora was 19, in the winter of 1888, a winter so cold that the creek behind the barn froze solid for 6 weeks. Edmund grieved in the way quiet men grieve, which is to say he did not speak of it at all and showed it only in how carefully he tended the things his wife had loved, the kitchen garden, the 2 rose bushes by the porch, the shelf of books she had brought from her mother's house. Nora stayed. There was never a question about it. She stayed and she ran the household accounts and she planted alongside her father and she became, over the following decade and a half, the person the farm could not function without. The debt they did not know about was a loan Edmund had taken in 1891, in the worst of the dry years, from a lending firm out of Topeka that operated through a local agent. It was a loan taken in desperation and signed in a moment of diminished hope, and Edmund had paid on it faithfully every year until his health began to fail in 1901. He had not told Nora about it. She did not learn of it until after he was buried, when the agent, Dobbins, with his gray suit and his leather satchel, appeared at the farmhouse door with the document and explained, in the patient tones of a man who had made this speech many times, that the remaining balance had accumulated interest of a nature that made the farm itself forfeit. Nora spent 3 months trying to dispute it. She wrote letters to the lending firm. She consulted the one attorney in Harlan Crossing, a man named Aldred, who reviewed the document and told her, with genuine regret, that he could find no provision that would save her. The terms were harsh but legal. The signature was her father's. The debt was real. She asked for additional time. She was given none. And so on a Tuesday morning in October of 1903, she walked away from the only home she had ever known with a canvas bag, $3, and the ledger reading skills her mother had given her. Which felt, in that moment, like the cruelest possible inheritance, the ability to understand exactly how thoroughly she had been dispossessed. The auction notice on the water tower post had been weathered to near illegibility, but Nora could make out enough. The Garvey Tower, as it was locally known, had been built in 1879 to supply the short-lived Garvey mill operation on the east side of town. The mill had closed in 1881 when Jonas Garvey died without heirs and his business partners dispersed. The tower had sat unused for over 20 years, passing through a tangle of estate claims and county liens until it arrived, unceremoniously, at public auction. Minimum bid, $3. No other bidder had appeared in 2 weeks of notice. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Purvis who ran the grain exchange on weekdays, looked at Nora with the particular expression of a man who has been surprised in a way he considers undignified. "You understand this is the tower only," he said. "Not the land beneath it. The land reverts to county. You'd be buying a structure you can't legally anchor." "I understand," Nora said. "It's got no utility. The tank leaks." "I know." He looked at her for a long moment, then took her $3 and wrote her a receipt in a small, skeptical hand. She heard him chuckling to himself as she walked away. The laughter followed her through town. She heard it in pieces, at the feed store, outside the milliner's, in the low conversation of 2 men outside the post office who did not bother to lower their voices when she passed. A woman with nothing buying something worth less than nothing. The joke wrote itself. Nora ignored it with the practiced stillness of someone who had learned long ago that other people's certainty was rarely as reliable as it felt. She returned to the tower that afternoon, in the cooling amber light of an October evening, and she walked its perimeter slowly, the way her father had walked fence lines, with attention. Without hurry. The structure was a 4-legged cypress and iron design, roughly 40 feet tall, with a cylindrical tank at the top that she estimated held perhaps 3,000 gallons at its original capacity. The legs were warped but not collapsed, bowing outward in the middle in a way that she recognized as a settling pattern rather than a failure pattern. The iron bands around the tank showed rust in long streaks, but the welds at the seams were intact. She pressed her hand against the nearest leg. Solid. Aged but solid. There was an access ladder running up the inside of the eastern leg, iron rungs bolted to the wood. And there was a hatch at the top where the ladder met the underside of the tank's maintenance walkway. The hatch was closed and she could see, even from the ground, that it was secured not by the original latch but by a padlock, a heavy, old padlock, dark with tarnish. That did not match the tower's age or hardware. Someone had locked something up there, and had done so deliberately. She stood looking at it until the light failed. Then she spread her coat on the ground at the base of the eastern leg, pulled her canvas bag beneath her head, and slept. In the morning, she found a way in. The padlock's hasp was iron, but the wood it was screwed into was not the tower's original timber, it was a newer board, fitted over the original hatch frame sometime after the mill's closing. And the screws had loosened over the years of freeze and thaw until they gave way with modest persuasion from the flat edge of the small awl Nora kept in her bag for stitching leather. The hasp pulled free, padlock and all, and the hatch swung upward on hinges that screamed with 2 decades of rust. She climbed. The ladder was sound. The rungs held her weight without flex. She emerged through the hatch onto a narrow walkway that circled the tank's equator, rusted iron mesh underfoot. And straightened into the clear Kansas morning with the whole of Harlan Crossing spread below her in the early light, the grid of streets, the grain elevator, the white spire of the Baptist church. The silver thread of Cutter Creek to the south. But it was not the view that stopped her breath. Lashed to the interior wall of the tank's access compartment, the shallow space between the outer ladder and the inner tank wall. Sheltered by a partial wooden overhang someone had fitted there years ago, was a oilskin bundle, tied with cord, roughly the size and shape of a large ledger book. It had been there long enough that the cord had stiffened and the oilskin had taken on the texture of bark. But it was dry. Whatever was inside had been protected. Nora's hands were steady as she untied it. Her mother's hands had been steady, too, and she had always taken that as a kind of inheritance she could not name until now. Feeling it in her own fingers as they worked the knots loose with unhurried precision. Inside the oilskin was not 1 ledger but 3, and a letter sealed in a plain white envelope that had yellowed to cream. She climbed back down the ladder with the bundle under her arm and sat at the base of the tower in the growing morning warmth and opened the letter first. It was dated June 14, 1882, and it was addressed, in a precise and educated hand, to no one by name, simply, to whoever finds this. It read as follows. And Nora read it twice before she looked up again at the tower above her, *I am leaving Harlan Crossing before sunrise. I will not say where I am going because I do not know, and because anyone who would pursue me has no rightful claim on me. What I leave here is the truth, as complete as I could make it, of what was done to this town between the years of 1877 and 1882 by the man who called himself its benefactor. I could not carry these books with me. I was afraid to burn them. I hid them in the only place I thought might outlast both of us. If you are reading this, you are either the man I fear, in which case I hope you feel the weight of what these pages say, or you are someone who can use them. I pray it is the latter. C.W.B. Nora opened the first ledger. It was a financial record, handwritten in multiple hands, covering a period of 5 years and detailing what appeared, at first reading, to be the ordinary accounts of a prosperous town business. But Nora had been reading ledgers since she was 7 years old, and what her mother had taught her, before the columns and the categories, before the sums, was this: every ledger has a story. And the story is told not by what is written but by what doesn't add up. She spent the morning with the books, sitting cross-legged in the yellow grass, and the story that emerged was not ordinary at all. In the late 1870s, Harlan Crossing had established a civic improvement fund, a communal account, fed by modest contributions from local businesses and farmers. Intended to finance the repair of the main road, the construction of a proper schoolhouse, and eventually the purchase of equipment for a volunteer fire company. The fund had been managed by a man named Aldous Prentice, who served simultaneously as town treasurer and the owner of Prentice Mercantile, the largest general store in the county. Aldous Prentice had been, by all surviving accounts, a pillar of Harlan Crossing. Nora knew the name. The Prentice family still operated the Mercantile, now run by Aldous's son, Harlan Prentice, who sat on the town council and was known for his charitable donations and his habit of sponsoring the church picnic every summer. The ledgers told a different story about Aldous Prentice. Over 5 years, through a series of transfers documented with careful, almost admiring deception, Aldous Prentice had diverted approximately $4,200 from the Civic Improvement Fund into his personal accounts and business holdings. He had done it gradually and cleverly, using duplicate entries, false vendor payments to entities that appeared legitimate but were not, and a system of delayed postings that obscured the timing of withdrawals. It was sophisticated fraud for a small Kansas town in 1877, and it had worked completely. The fund had been declared insolvent in 1882. With no public explanation beyond administrative mismanagement, and the schoolhouse had never been built, the road had never been repaired, and the volunteer fire company had remained a rumor. The town had mourned the loss and moved on, because small towns in Kansas in 1882 had no other option. What the ledgers also contained, and this was what made Nora's hands still in the grass and her heart do something complicated and quiet in her chest, was a secondary record of who had contributed to the fund. Farmers. Shopkeepers. A seamstress named Agnes Hollowell who had given $2 in the spring of 1879. A widower named Marsh Cutter who had given $5, which represented, by Nora's estimation of what $5 meant to a man with a small creek farm in 1879, an almost painful generosity. Her father's name was there. Edmund Fenn. $3 in 1878. Another $3 in 1880. She sat with that for a long time, looking at his handwriting, no, not his handwriting, someone else's transcription of his name, but still, there it was. Proof of his faith in a community that had been quietly robbed by the man trusted to protect it. The person who had assembled these records, who had hidden them here, was identified only by those initials, CWB. Whoever they were, they had been a bookkeeper or accountant, someone inside Prentice's confidence who had seen the truth and lacked the protection or the standing to say so openly. Who had left in the night rather than confront a man who was, by then, the most powerful person in Harlan Crossing. Nora read every page. She read them twice. She was not a lawyer and she was not a judge, but she had grown up in this county and she knew who was, and she knew what was possible and what was not. And by the time the afternoon light slanted low across the grass, she had a clear and steady sense of exactly what she meant to do. The trouble began within a week. She had said nothing to anyone about what she had found. She had done what her instincts told her to do first. She had gone to the county seat, 20 miles east, on a borrowed horse, and spent 2 days in the records office reviewing deeds, liens, and the county's archived financial documents from the civic fund period. What she found there confirmed the ledgers. There were discrepancies in the public records that matched, with uncomfortable precision, the manipulation she had traced in the hidden books. She made careful notes, in the same narrow handwriting her mother had taught her, and she returned to Harlan Crossing. The difficulty was that she needed help. Specifically, she needed someone with legal standing, someone who could present what she had found to a proper authority. And the only attorney in Harlan Crossing was Aldred, who had reviewed her father's loan documents. She went to him. She should have read him more carefully before she opened her mouth. Aldred listened. He was a thin man with small eyes that moved like a bird's, quick and assessing, and as she spoke, she watched those eyes lose the polite performance of attention and become something else, calculating, private. He asked her where the ledgers were. She told him they were safe, without specifying where. He told her the matter was very old and that statutes of limitations likely applied and that she should think very carefully before making accusations against a family as established as the Prentices. She thanked him and left. Within 24 hours, Harlan Prentice appeared at the water tower. He was a large man in his late 40s, ruddy-faced, with the confident bearing of someone who had never been told, in any serious way, that he could not have what he wanted. He had 2 men with him, employees of the mercantile, and he stood at the base of the tower and called up to Nora, who was on the walkway and had seen them coming across the field. "Miss Fenn," he said, his voice carrying the careful pleasantness of a man containing considerable displeasure. "I understand you've been poking around in old county records." "People are allowed to review public records," Nora said. "They are. And I also understand you found some items up there that might belong to my family." "I found items that belong to the people of this county," Nora said. The pleasantness thinned. "You're a woman with no land, no home, and no standing in this community. And I would encourage you to think carefully about what kind of trouble you're able to manage on your own." Nora looked at him for a moment from her height on the walkway. The sun was behind her. She was aware of this. "I'm not on my own," she said. Which was not, at that precise moment, strictly true, but she had learned from her father that there was a difference between a lie and a statement made in the direction of what you intended to make real. Prentice left. But the following night, someone came and knocked the eastern leg of the tower with what must have been a considerable implement. Because Nora woke to a shudder that ran through the whole structure and found a fresh split in the wood at the base of the leg. It had not been enough to bring anything down, but it had been a message. She moved the ledgers the next morning to the care of the Baptist minister. A man named Reverend Oakes, who had served Harlan Crossing for 18 years and whose opinion of the Prentice family's civic generosity was now, once Nora had spent 2 hours with him, somewhat revised. Oakes was not a lawyer. But he was trusted in the way that small-town ministers are trusted, widely, by people who trusted no one else, and he had connections, through his denominational network. To a circuit judge based in Salina who was known, Oakes said, for being unmovable. Nora wrote the letter herself. Oakes signed it. They sent it by the morning post. What followed over the next 6 weeks was not dramatic in the way that stories are sometimes dramatic. There was no courtroom thunder, no public confrontation in the town square. Justice, when it comes to financial crimes in small Kansas counties in 1903, tends to move in the manner of a river in dry season, quietly, persistently, reshaping its bed without announcing what it's doing. The circuit judge, his name was Hogreave. And he had a reputation for reading documents with the patience of a man who had time and the temperament of a man who had none for dishonesty, reviewed what Nora had assembled and found it sufficient to initiate a formal inquiry. He appointed an independent assessor from Topeka. The assessor spent 3 weeks in Harlan Crossing, cross-referencing the hidden ledgers against public records, bank archives, and the Prentice Mercantile's own surviving accounts. The assessor's report was 47 pages long. Nora read every page. Harlan Prentice had not personally conducted his father's fraud. But he had inherited a business that had been built, in part, on the proceeds of it, and he had, the assessor found, continued to suppress any investigation into the 1882 fund collapse, including, specifically, blocking a 1897 attempt by a former town council member to reopen the matter. This suppression constituted its own legal violation, and the assessor said so plainly. The Prentice Mercantile was assessed a civil judgment of $4,800, the original amount, plus a calculated interest that the judge deemed reasonable. The sum was to be held by the county and disbursed, with input from a community committee, for the purposes the fund had originally intended. Harlan Prentice did not go to prison. The law of the time and place did not easily accommodate that outcome for a man of his standing, and Nora was not naive enough to have expected it. What happened instead was quieter and, in certain ways, more complete. The judgment was public record, the assessor's report was public record. And Harlan Crossing was a small town where people read public records and remembered what they read. The Prentice Mercantile did not close, but its dominance in the county commerce shifted, quietly and permanently, over the following years. Harlan Prentice retired from the town council in the spring of 1904. He did not seek re-election. Aldred, the attorney, lost several clients that autumn. He did not appear to understand why, which suggested to Nora that he had not, in his life, spent enough time being still and watching. The Civic Fund, reconstituted, properly overseen, and seated with the Prentice judgment, built a schoolhouse in 1905. It was not the schoolhouse Cecilia Fenn had dreamed of for her daughter, but it was the schoolhouse that the children of Harlan Crossing had been owed for 20 years. And when Nora stood at its cornerstone laying in the spring of that year, she thought of her mother's finger-tracing ledger columns by lamplight. And she understood that the numbers had been telling this story all along, waiting for someone who knew how to read them. The matter of Nora herself was resolved in a way she had not anticipated. The initiating inquiry, which required establishing that Nora had legal access to the materials she had found, required establishing clear ownership of the water tower. In the process of confirming her $3 purchase and its legitimacy, the county records were reviewed more thoroughly than they had been at the time of the auction. It emerged that the parcel of land beneath the tower, the land that had been described as reverting to county ownership, had in fact been improperly classified. Having been included in the original Garvey Mill property deed without proper separation. The tower and the land it stood on were, by a legitimate reading of the 1879 deed, inseparable in their conveyance. Nora Fenn, who had bought a rusted water tower for $3, had also, by the letter of a deed written 24 years earlier and never properly revisited, bought the half-acre of land beneath it. She was told this by the county clerk, a careful woman named Mrs. Drum, on a warm afternoon in December of 1903, and the clerk delivered the news with the slightly stunned quality of someone relaying a fact they themselves cannot quite credit. Nora thanked her. She walked back to the tower in the winter light, and she leaned against its eastern leg, the one that someone had tried to split. The one she had braced herself with rope and salvaged timber 2 days after the attack. The one that now stood straight again, and she put her hand against the wood the way her father used to put his hand against fence posts, checking for solidity. Confirming that what you had built would hold. It held. Over the following year, Nora Fenn built a house. It was not a large house. It sat at the foot of the water tower, which she had repaired and stabilized, not because it had any utility, the tank still leaked and would always leak, but because it was hers. And because she had begun to understand it as a kind of emblem of what she had learned. That things others dismissed as worthless sometimes contained precisely what a place had lost and needed to recover. She operated from the house as a financial records agent. There was no formal title for it in Harlan Crossing in 1904, but the function was clear enough. She reviewed accounts. She kept books for the 3 local businesses that asked. She consulted with the new Civic Fund Committee on its record-keeping practices, establishing a system of transparent double-entry bookkeeping that would, by her design, make the kind of fraud Aldous Prentice had committed impossible to conceal. The contributors to the original fund, those whose names appeared in the hidden ledgers, were not, under the law, entitled to individual restitution. As the civil judgment had gone to the civic purpose rather than to persons. But Nora kept the list. She kept it in the same way her mother had kept her teaching materials, carefully, for a purpose that might not announce itself for years. She found a use for it in the end, through Reverend Oakes and the church auxiliary, in the form of a quiet memorial in the new schoolhouse, a brass plate, modest in size, bearing the names of every person who had contributed to the original fund, with a date and an amount. Most of them were dead by then. Some of their children were not. It was not money. It was the other kind of accounting, the one her mother had taught her was more important, the record of what people had given and been owed, held against loss, restored to light. Her father's name was there. Edmund Fenn. $3 in 1878. $3 in 1880. She stood in the new schoolhouse on the day the plate was unveiled and she let herself feel, for the first time in a long time, that the ledger was balanced. We have told you the story of Nora Fenn. A woman cast out with $3 and a canvas bag, who spent those dollars on a rusted tower that everyone knew was worthless. Who climbed that tower alone in the early morning of an October day and found, sealed in oilskin and tied with stiffened cord, the truth that a town had been denied for 2 decades. Who spent her winter not in bitterness at what had been taken from her, but in the patient, precise work of restoring what had been taken from everyone. We began by telling you she had nothing. That was accurate, and it was also, in the way of many accurate things, incomplete. She had her mother's teaching. She had her father's steadiness. She had the habit of stillness, of watching, of knowing that what a thing appeared to be was rarely the whole story of what it was. She had, without knowing it, exactly the skills required to read the evidence hidden above her, because the evidence was written in the language her mother had taught her. The language of columns and figures, of what adds up and what doesn't, of the story that numbers tell when people won't. We tell you this not because it is a story about hidden treasure, though it is also that. We tell it because it is a story about what overlooked things sometimes hold, the water tower, the ledger, the woman herself. All of them standing in a field while the town walked past and saw only what they expected to see. Nora Fenn saw differently. She had always seen differently. And in the end, what she saw was enough to change her own circumstances, enough to restore something long stolen. Enough to put her father's name on a brass plate in a schoolhouse built with money that should have built it 20 years before. We think she would consider that a fair accounting. She would know. She was very good with numbers. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Nora's story. If this one moved something in you, we hope you'll share it with someone who might need to hear it today, someone who's been told that what they have isn't enough. Or that what they're holding on to isn't worth the trouble. And we'll leave you with this question, the one we always come back to after a story like hers: what is something in your own life that others told you to let go of? That turned out to hold far more than anyone suspected? We would love to hear your answer in the comments. Every response reminds us that Nora's kind of quiet stubbornness is not rare, it is simply underestimated, which may be exactly the point. Until next time, stay close.